The title of this sort of, I hope you have sandwiches, Casa sandwiches, of my lecture today is actually reflections on me, us, and an LAS education, a pre-commencement lecture, which sounds a little bit maybe unusual, but you will see what I'm trying to get at here in a minute. And, you know, obviously throughout the last 50 years of my life, I guess, and especially the last 5 weeks, I've been thinking a lot about LAS education. I think many of you have also been thinking a lot over the past weeks about this topic. What is LAS education? Why is it worth fighting for? Why does society need to retain this type of education? And what I wanted to do today in this little lunchtime lecture is to try to point us towards some of those sorts of questions in a sort of more focused, constructive, and sort of productive manner. You know, we've been spending a lot of time and energy over the past few weeks in sort of negative space. You know, we've been busy criticizing and critiquing and looking closely at, for example, the proposed new curriculum here. But here today, I really don't want to do that at all. And we're all heading off to hopefully some calmer days during our much needed spring break, some rest and some calmness, some more reflection. And I want to try and help us begin thinking more positively and constructively and productively. You know, what can, should, might an LAS education look like? And what might it be able to achieve for, say, our community and for our society and for our students? And I've been asked by some students to please make this lecture, quote, academic. And I understand that request, trust me. But it's also made me, that request, ask myself what makes something, especially my field of anthropology, academic. And I guess my answer to that question, at least from my anthropological perspective, is I'm not really sure. And those of you who know anthropology will recall that us sociocultural anthropologists study like ordinary people's everyday lives. Our everyday lives. So some might say yes as to whether or not studying our everyday lives is a form of an academic pursuit. I mean, after all, when you eat lunch like you are now, are you in the space of academics or not? That's a question worth thinking about. Again, some might say yes, others might say no, that's not academics. Is there anything academic about the ways we prepare or consume our food? Cos, as he eats his sandwich that he has prepared and is now consuming it, is there anything academic about what you are doing right now? Or in the way that we raise our children, as I've done and I assume many of you will do as well in future years. Is that an academic thing? Or let's say the infinite other ordinary possibilities, but the banal ways that we live our everyday lives. Is any of that academic? But in anthropology, we do study everyday, ordinary, boring lives in small places with a particular purpose in mind and with a big question in mind. Hence, we say anthropologists ask big questions in little places. You know this. We might say that we ask big questions about ordinary, quotidian, banal aspects of human life. Yep. So it's really the big question married together with the ordinary aspects of our little lives that converts the so-called non-academic into the academic, I think. And a few weeks ago when I lectured on the topic of anthropological theory is practice, the is part of that title was also pointing in the same direction. We all live and need anthropology as a sort of everyday life skill, I'm trying to argue. And for that reason, theory is practice. high-flying anthropological theory, that which we normally associate with academics, is in fact ordinary, banal, and boring, everyday sort of stuff. As an introduction then, I just want to say that if I end up talking about ordinary, banal things that take place around here, around this little place, please recognize that I am just doing that anthropological thing. That academic thing, I would say, that I and we anthropologists have been doing and are in the habit of doing for more than a century. The second frame I want to set up around this little lunchtime lecture takes me back to something else I've been thinking a lot about over the past few weeks, and about the past 20 years, in fact. I spoke about it in one of my earlier lectures as well. Here I'm referring to this idea that I've been throwing around recently, the idea that young people today are consumed by what I and generations above me have been not consumed with. Let me state that a little bit differently. Young people today are not consumed by what I and generations above me have been consumed with for so long. That being questions and tensions surrounding an us versus them paradigmatic view of the world. My argument has been, or is developing, and I'm developing through talking to you guys and writing these lectures late at night, or literally this one 30 minutes before I got in the car to come here. My argument that I'm trying to work out and is that you all and the many cohorts of students that I have had the privilege of talking with and listening to and sharing with for the past 2 decades in this little place have been trapped in a sort of different paradigmatic struggle. It's a struggle not between us and them, but a struggle between me and us. And I can see this shift in so many different ways all around me. And I can see how this shift from a paradigmatic framing of the world of us versus them toward a new paradigmatic framing of a world of me versus us, I see how that shift is causing and generating a lot of tension in the world today. And between older folks like me and us, and younger folks like you and your us. My modern world, I am a product of modernity, right? My modern world and the world of Trump and other such older luminaries was a binary one. It was a stable binary one. There was the Cold War. And there was the Soviets versus the Americans. That's what I grew up with. That's what we grew up with, where I came from. That's what everyone around here in Europe grew up with. There was capitalism versus communism. There was freedom versus tyranny. Man versus woman. Gay versus straight. And plain old good versus evil. It was a simple world, a binary world. It was much simpler. And it was a world which framed all of those binaries around an us and them. And your postmodern world, our newer postmodern world, is no longer binary. There's no Cold War tension anymore, but rather a much more open and competitive world of geopolitics. There are not two competing dominant ideologies circling the globe, but countless ideologies. There's no longer simply man and woman, but there is man, woman, trans, non-binary, etc. There's no longer gay versus straight. Okay, there was bi back then as well. But there are all those other sexual configurations that you all know so well. Pan, asexual, polysexual, etc. There's no longer simply good or evil either, but lots of shades and grayness in between. And along with these shifts from a binary ordering of life to a multivariant, multivocal, fractured ordering of life, also comes a shift away from an us versus them paradigmatic framing to a me versus us framing. And it's of course not a total shift. It's just a movement toward a me versus us dominance. Not so very different for those of you who are Foucault fans, and we've discussed the shift that Foucault talks about in around the 16th, 17th century in Western Europe, where he talks about a visible shift between a sovereign form of power and a disciplinary form of power. Foucault does not argue that at some point there's no longer sovereign power. He argues that the nature of power is shifting. It's like a scale, and suddenly sovereign power becomes less important and disciplinary power becomes more important. And I'm trying to sort of suggest the same sort of thing is happening in relation to these two paradigmatic frames that I think people in today's world are living through. On the one hand, an us versus them, for us oldies, and for you youngies, a more us versus me paradigm. And I'm saying that as you all are aging, and we're aging, that this us versus them paradigm is becoming more central in the world, and the us versus me paradigm is becoming more central in the world, and the us versus them paradigm is starting to wane. And maybe I'm trying to note some sort of similar shift that I've been noticing over the past 50 years of my conscious life, and 30 years of my life as a professional asking big questions in small places. And added to that observation, along with these shifts of frame and ordering, we are also possibly working toward what I'm thinking about as a post-human world. I've talked about that recently as well. An impending era of post-humanity, which requires a lot more thinking. But that big idea is this idea that we're moving into a period of post-humanity is a bit beyond the scope of what I wanted to talk about today, which is actually much more centered on the me versus us tension that inhabits our world, and I think your world. And also, I have to say, inhabits every single one of us as an individual human being. And I am interested in how that me versus us tension manifests itself within our educational systems and within our educational curriculum here at UCR. So the rest of my lecture is actually a story about it's ethnography. It's like a story about everyday, ordinary, maybe you might think non-academic stuff. This is what ethnographers do. We write in our ethnographies about really boring things that people do. I'm going to go to ethnography now. And it has to do with UCR students, this story, this ethnography, and students everywhere. It has to do with LAS education. It has to do with fish and water. It has to do with commencement speeches that students listen to before they and you will receive your university degree. And it has to do with me and us. And so the rest of my lecture begins with an ordinary, banal, personal story. And here it goes. I woke up 2 days ago. I got out of bed. And I woke up and I instantly had a thought in my head. And I do not know where it came from. And the thought was this. I once read a book 15 years ago. And I need to find that book right now. I didn't remember the author's name. I didn't remember the title of the book. I didn't remember where I got it from. I just knew that there was this book that I wanted and needed to read. That was my first thought of the day. I promise you. Ask my wife. I get up, I'm in my pajamas, and I'm looking through every bloody shelf of my bookshelves everywhere in the house. And I can't find the thing. It took me an hour and a half. And eventually I found the book. And I shouted down the stairs, I got it, I got it. It was this book. Okay, very ordinary story. I found the book. I began reading it. I didn't totally remember what it was about. It's been 15 years. And so I started reading it. And I started, opening it up and reading this book. And inside this book, it was like this. I found this orange note. And then I read the note. And I thought about the note's author. And I was brought back to the year 2011 at this little place. That's how my ordinary, banal, everyday morning began 2 days ago. And now I want to go back to 2011 and tell the story for you in reverse, right? Which is the actual temporal way in which this story unfolded for me the first time. And that's what I want to do. And it begins with a commencement speech, believe it or not, in 2011 for a student who was graduating from here. His name was Ginger. And back in those days, our students used to get to ask one of their professors to give a private, personal speech, commencement speech for them. And especially during the January graduations, every student that was being sort of awarded a degree, a faculty member would come up and say some words about that student. It was really lovely. And Ginger asked me to do that. So I stood up in front of the hall and I gave this little commencement speech to Ginger. I found it. It was on my computer. I downloaded it, and I'm going to give it to you. And it went like this. Ginger began his studies at New York University, where he spent 2 years. He decided to come to Middleburg, he told me, because he found Manhattan a bit too small. So Ginger graduates today after having been with us for only 3 short semesters. Unfortunately, I've only had the pleasure of knowing him since this past September. Though we've only known each other for a few months, it does indeed feel like much longer than that. The reason being, I think, has to do with the type of person and the type of student Ginger is. From my perspective as a fellow human being, and from the many conversations that we have had about nothing in particular, I have come to know Ginger as a sensitive, compassionate, aware, and conscientious person, and as someone who is committed to contributing to a better world. From my perspective as one of his former teachers, I also have to say that Ginger is a dream of a student. He is not only diligent, motivated, and serious, but he is also engaging, reflective, and critical. He takes absolutely full advantage of opportunities to learn, which I must say made me realize how much of my own undergraduate studies I wasted away. As a teacher, I've been most impressed by Ginger's openness, his openness to new ideas and to new possibilities, and very importantly, I have been inspired by his uncanny ability to constantly reflect his new learning off his previous knowledge and experiences, and then to integrate those insights into his understanding of the world. Let me just give you a quick example here, and I hope Ginger won't be too embarrassed, because what I want to share with you is also very endearing. The last paper that Ginger submitted in my course was entitled State Violence and the Erosion of Civil Liberties, the Study of the State and Its Use for Ordinary Citizens. And this opening paragraph of that paper read like this, and I'm quoting Ginger. Until I was about 7, I kept a jar of honey on my nightstand. The reason was that if the wolves would come at night, they'd eat the honey instead of me. I've never lived anywhere remotely close to wolves, but without the honey, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't until much later in my life that I realized that what I thought were wolves in our garden were in fact trees, stones, and garden utensils. Although the cause of my fear, wolves, was imaginary, its effects, fear, honey, hiding under the covers, were very much real. The state is real in the same way that the wolves are. While the state is imagined and socially constructed, the myriad ways in which it affects our lives are very real. He was taking this course that you guys are enrolled in this semester. Let me carry on with my commencement speech. When I first met Ginger, he told me of his plans to complete his program at what was then called Roosevelt Academy, and then immediately study law at the master's level. During the past few months, he has revised his plans. It happens sometimes. Instead, he now intends to take some time outside the confines of formal education in order to learn in new ways. Though the last time we spoke, he wasn't quite sure yet as to what that might actually entail. He was thinking possibly of volunteering for a social justice organization or working overseas, perhaps teaching English, or maybe even traveling aimlessly. I think Ginger is very courageous in making this decision, especially in this day and age when everything pressures our graduating students in the direction of gaining even more formal education, and as quickly as possible. At this point in his life, Ginger is choosing to take the road less traveled. Along the way, Ginger, you will begin learning in very new and exciting ways, but you will also most certainly encounter many shadows and many wolves. In the end, though, and just like when you were a child, you will eventually come to see those shadows and wolves for what they really are. As a small contribution to the pavement of that road, I thought that a little something could give you courage and confidence to persevere. So let me present to you with this travel-sized jar of honey for you to take with you. I'm sure it will serve you well. Ginger, good luck with everything, and congratulations to you. That's what I said in front of 300 people, whoever was attending. Okay. A week later, I find this book and this note in my, I don't think we had mailboxes in those days, waiting for me. It says, "Dear John, although roughly 4 weeks too late," I guess it was a month later, "I still wanted to thank you for the great speech you gave at my graduation. I've waited this long because I also wanted to include some updates on my future plans, but until last week there weren't any worth mentioning. I've added a small present to the letter as a way to express my gratitude. It's also a speech. In fact, it's a commencement speech given by David Foster Wallace. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this particular edition, but it was the only published version I could find. I've also attached an article about the U.S. News College rankings from last week's New Yorker and thought you'd find it interesting. I'll send you the updates later this week. Thanks again. Best, Ginger." That's how I got this book. It's called This Is Water, Some Thoughts Delivered on a Significant Occasion About Living a Compassionate Life by David Foster Wallace. Has anyone ever heard of this author? David Foster Wallace is a product of liberal arts and sciences education in the United States. He graduated from Amherst College, which is probably the quintessential LAS program in America. And it's an excellent school. It's an Ivy League school. He studied English and creative writing. And he went on to become the first great 21st century novelist in America, I would say. And he wrote a number of books, to which I must confess I haven't had the time to read any of them yet. I wanted to after I read this. And I looked into them, and they're very heavy, and they're difficult, and they're intense. And I didn't have the time and the concentration back then to do it. I might come back to it now, but they're heavy going. But I read this book. And David Foster Wallace, he died eventually in 2008, I think, way before his time. But in 2004, he delivered this commencement speech at Kenyon College, which is another liberal arts and science college in the United States. And he was working at a couple of different liberal arts and science colleges as a literature professor and as a creative writing professor. And that's how he was basically funding his addiction to writing novels. So he would go from one year to the next, from one sort of one-year fellowship, teaching young people in liberal arts and sciences colleges creative writing and literature, and in the evenings he would work on his novels, and after 1 or 2 years he'd move on to another university. He kept doing this, and he produced some really, really outstanding, so the literary critics say, pieces of work. But this is what Ginger gave to me in return, a speech. And I woke up that morning the other day just wanting this. I didn't even remember what was in it. So of course I read it, and I read it back then as well. And I'm going to read it to you right now. It's called This Is Water, Some Thoughts Delivered on a Significant Occasion About Living a Compassionate Life. David Foster Wallace. And the preface says, David Foster Wallace was invited to speak to the 2005 graduating class of Kenyon College on a subject of his choosing. It was the only such address he ever made. And his address began this way. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" This is a standard requirement of U.S. commencement speeches, the deployment of didactic little parable-ish stories. The story thing turns out to be one of the better, less bullshitty conventions of the genre. But if you're worried that I plan to present myself here as the wise old fish explaining what water is to you younger fish, please don't be. I am not the wise old fish. The immediate point of the fish story is merely that the most obvious, ubiquitous, important realities are often the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. Stated as an English sentence, of course, this is just a banal platitude. But the fact is that in the day-to-day trenches of adult existence, banal platitudes can have a life or death importance. Or so I wish to suggest to you on this dry and lovely morning. Of course, the main requirement of speeches like this is that I'm supposed to talk about your liberal arts education's meaning, to try and explain why the degree you're about to receive has actual human value instead of just material payoff. So let's talk about the single most pervasive cliche in the commencement speech genre, which is that a liberal arts education is not so much about filling you up with knowledge as it is about, quote, teaching you how to think. If you're like me as a college student, you've never liked hearing this, and you tend to feel a bit insulted by the claim that you've needed anybody to teach you how to think, since the fact that you even got admitted to a college this good seems like proof that you already know how to think. But I'm going to posit to you that the liberal arts cliche turns out not to be insulting at all, because the really significant education in thinking that we're supposed to get in a place like this isn't really about the capacity to think, but rather about the choice of what to think about. If your complete freedom of choice regarding what to think about seems too obvious to waste time talking about, I'd ask you to think about fish and water, and to bracket for just a few minutes your skepticism about the value of the totally obvious. Here's another didactic little story. There are these two guys sitting together in a bar in the remote Alaskan wilderness. One of the guys is religious, the other's an atheist. And they're arguing about the existence of God with that special intensity that comes after about the fourth beer. And the atheist says, look, it's not like I don't have actual reasons for not believing in God. It's not like I haven't ever experimented with the whole God and prayer thing. Just last month, I got caught off away from the camp in the terrible blizzard, and I couldn't see a thing. And I was totally lost, and it was 50 below. And so I tried it. I fell to my knees in the snow and I cried out, God, if there's a God, I'm lost in this blizzard and I'm going to die if you don't help me. And now, in the bar, the religious guy looks up at the atheist all puzzled. Well, then, you must believe now, he says. After all, here you are, alive. The atheist rolls his eyes like the religious guy is a total simp. No, man. All that happened was that a couple of Eskimos just happened to come wandering by, and they showed me the way to back to the camp. It's easy to run this story through a kind of standard liberal arts analysis. The exact same experience can mean two completely different things to two different people, given those people's two different beliefs, templates, and two different ways of constructing meaning from experience. Because we prize tolerance and diversity of belief, nowhere in our liberal arts analysis do we want to claim that one guy's interpretation is true and the other guy's is false or bad. Which is fine, except we also never end up talking about just where these individual templates and beliefs come from, meaning where they come from inside the two guys. As if a person's most basic orientation toward the world and the meaning of his experience were somehow automatically hardwired, like height or shoe size, or absorbed from the culture, like language. As if how we construct meaning were not actually a matter of personal, intentional choice of conscious decision. Plus, there's the matter of arrogance. The non-religious guy is so totally obnoxiously confident in his dismissal of the possibility that the Eskimos had anything to do with his prayer for help. True, there are plenty of religious people who seem arrogantly certain of their own interpretations, too. They're probably even more repulsive than atheists, at least to most of us here, but the fact is that religious dogmatists' problem is exactly the same as the story's atheists: arrogance, blind certainty, a closed-mindedness that's like an imprisonment so complete that the prisoner doesn't even know he's locked up. The point here is that I think this is one part of what the liberal arts mantra of teaching me how to think is really supposed to mean. To be just a little less arrogant, to have some critical awareness about myself and my certainties, because a huge percentage of the stuff that I tend to be automatically certain of, it turns out, is totally wrong and deluded. I've learned this the hard way, as I predict you graduates will too. Here's one example of the utter wrongness of something I tend to be automatically sure of. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe, the realest, most vivid and important person in existence. We rarely think about this sort of natural, basic self-centeredness because it's so socially repulsive, but it's pretty much the same for all of us, deep down. It is our default setting, hardwired into our boards at birth. Think about it. There is no experience you've had that you were not at the absolute center of. The world, as you experience it, is there in front of you or behind you, to the left or to the right of you on your TV or your monitor or whatever. Other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, and real. You get the idea. But please don't worry that I'm getting ready to preach to you about compassion or other directedness or all the so-called virtues. This is not a matter of virtue. It's a matter of my choosing to do the work of somehow altering or getting free of my natural hardwired default setting, which is to be deeply and literally self-centered and to see and interpret everything through the lens of the self. People who can adjust their natural default setting this way are often described as being, quote, well-adjusted, which I suggest to you is not an accidental term. Given the academic setting here, an obvious question is how much of this work of adjusting our default setting involves actual knowledge or intellect? The answer, not surprisingly, is that it depends what kind of knowledge we're talking about. Probably the most dangerous thing about an academic education, at least in my own case, is that it enables my tendency to over-intellectualize stuff, to get lost in abstract thinking instead of simply paying attention to what's going on in front of me, instead of paying attention to what's going on inside of me. As I'm sure you guys know by now, it is extremely difficult to stay alert and attentive instead of getting hypnotized by the constant monologue inside your head. What you don't yet know are the stakes of this struggle. In the 20 years since my own graduation, I've come gradually to understand these stakes and to see that the liberal arts cliche about teaching you how to think was actually a shorthand for a very deep and important truth. Learning how to think really means learning how to exercise some control over how and what you think. It means being conscious and aware enough to choose what you pay attention to and to choose how you construct meaning from experience. Because if you cannot or will not exercise this kind of choice in adult life, you will be totally hosed. Think of the old cliche about the mind being a, quote, excellent servant but a terrible master. This, like many cliches, so lame and banal on the surface, actually expresses a great and terrible truth. It is not the least bit coincidental that adults who commit suicide with firearms nearly always shoot themselves in the head. And the truth is that most of these suicides are actually dead long before they pull the trigger. And I submit that this is what the real no-shit value of your liberal arts education is supposed to be about. How to keep from going through your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life dead, unconscious, a slave to your head and to your natural default setting of being uniquely, completely, and purely alone day in and day out. That may sound like hyperbole or abstract nonsense. So let's get concrete. The plain fact is that you, graduating seniors, do not yet have any clue what day in and day out really means. There happen to be whole large parts of adult American life that nobody talks about in commencement speeches. One such part involves boredom, routine, and petty frustration. The parents and older folks here will know all too well what I'm talking about. By way of example, let's say it's an average adult day, and you get up in the morning, go to your challenging white-collar college graduate job, and you work hard for 9 or 10 hours, and at the end of the day, you're tired and you're stressed out. And all you want to do is go home and have a good supper and maybe unwind for a couple hours, and then hit the rack early because you have to get up the next day and do it all again. But then you remember there's no food at home. You haven't had time to shop this week because of your challenging job. And so now, after work, you have to get in your car and drive to the supermarket. It's the end of the workday, and the traffic's very bad. So getting to the store takes way longer than it should. And when you finally get there, the supermarket is very crowded because, of course, it's the time of day when all the other people with jobs also try to squeeze in some grocery shopping, and the store is hideously fluorescently lit and infused with soul-killing muzak or corporate pop, and it's pretty much the last place you want to be, but you can't just get in and quickly out. You have to wander all over the huge overlit store's crowded aisles to find the stuff you want, and you have to maneuver your junky cart through all these other tired, hurried people with carts. And of course, there are also the glacially slow old people and the spacey people and the ADHD kids who all block the aisle, and you have to grit your teeth and try to be polite as you ask them to let you buy, and eventually, finally, you get all your supper supplies, except now it turns out there aren't enough checkout lanes open, even though it's the end of the day rush, so the checkout line is incredibly long, which is stupid and infuriating. But you can't take your fury out on the frenetic lady working the register, who is overworked at a job whose daily tedium and meaninglessness surpasses the imagination of any of us here at a prestigious college. But anyway, you finally get to the checkout line's front, and you pay for your goods, and you wait to get your check or card authenticated by a machine, and you get to hold the "have a nice day" in a voice that is absolutely the voice of death. And then you have to take your creepy, flimsy plastic bags of groceries in your cart with the one crazy wheel that pulls maddeningly to the left all the way out through the crowded, bumpy, littery parking lot, and try to load the bags in your car in such a way that everything doesn't fall out of the bags and roll around in the trunk on the way home. And then you have to drive all the way home through slow, heavy, SUV-intensive rush hour traffic, etc., etc. Everyone here has done this, of course, but it hasn't yet been part of your graduate's actual life routine, day after week, after month, after year. But it will be, and many more dreary, annoying, seemingly meaningless routines besides. Except that's not the point. The point is that petty, frustrating crap like this is exactly where the work of choosing comes in. Because the traffic jams and crowded aisles and long checkout lines give me time to think, and if I don't make a conscious decision about how to think and what to pay attention to, I'm going to be pissed off and miserable every time I have to food shop, because my natural default setting is that situations like this are really all about me, about my hungriness and my fatigue and my desire to just get home, and it's going to seem for all the world like everybody else is just in my way. And who the fuck are all these people in my way? And look at how repulsive most of them are, and how stupid and cow-like and dead-eyed and non-human they seem here at the checkout lane. Or at how annoying and rude it is that people are talking loudly on cell phones in the middle of the line. And look at how deeply unfair this is. I've worked really hard all day, and I'm starved and tired, and I can't even get home to eat and unwind because of all these stupid goddamn people. Or, of course, if I'm in a more socially conscious liberal arts form of my default setting, I can spend time in the end of the day traffic jam being angry and disgusted at all the huge, stupid, lane-blocking SUVs and Hummers and V12 pickup trucks burning their wasteful, selfish 40-gallon tanks of gas, and I can dwell on the fact that the patriotic or religious bumper stickers always seem to be on the biggest, most disgustingly selfish vehicles driven by the ugliest, most inconsiderate and aggressive drivers, who are usually talking on cell phones as they cut people off in order to get just 20 stupid feet ahead in the traffic jam. And I can think about how our children's children will despise us for wasting all the future's fuel and probably screwing up the climate, and how spoiled and stupid and selfish and disgusting we all are, and how it all just sucks, and so on and so forth. Look, if I choose to think this way, fine, lots of us do, except that thinking this way tends to be so easy and automatic, it doesn't even have to be a choice. Thinking this way is my natural default setting. It's the automatic, unconscious way that I experience the boring, frustrating, crowded parts of adult life when I'm operating on the automatic, unconscious belief that I am the center of the world and that my immediate needs and feelings are what should determine the world's priorities. The thing is that there are obviously different ways to think about these kinds of situations. In this traffic, all these vehicles stuck and idling in my way. It's not impossible that some of these people in SUVs have been in horrible auto accidents in the past and now find driving so traumatic that the therapist has all but ordered them to get a huge, heavy SUV so that they can feel safe enough to drive. Or that the Hummer that just cut me off is maybe being driven by a father whose little child is hurt or sick in the seat next to him and he's trying to rush to the hospital. And he's in a way bigger, more legitimate hurry than I am. It is actually I who am in his way. Or I can choose to force myself to consider the likelihood that everyone else in the supermarket's checkout line is probably just as bored and frustrated as I am, and that some of these people actually have much harder, more tedious, or more painful lives than I do overall, and so on. Again, please don't think that I'm giving you moral advice, or that I'm saying you are supposed to think this way, or that anyone expects you to just automatically do it, because it's hard. It takes will and mental effort, and if you're like me, some days you won't be able to do it, or else you just flat out won't want to. But most days, if you're aware enough to give yourself a choice, you can choose to look differently at this fat, dead-eyed, over-made-up lady who just screamed at her kid in the checkout line. Maybe she's not usually like this. Maybe she's been up 3 straight nights holding the hand of her husband who's dying of bone cancer. Or maybe this very lady is the low-wage clerk at the motor vehicles department who just yesterday helped your spouse resolve a nightmarish red tape problem through some small act of bureaucratic kindness. Of course, none of this is likely, but it's always also not impossible. It just depends what you want to consider. If you're automatically sure that you know what reality is and who and what is really important, if you want to operate on your default setting, then you, like me, probably will not consider possibilities that aren't pointless and annoying. But if you've really learned how to think, how to pay attention, then you will know you have other options. It will actually be within your power to experience a crowded, hot, slow, consumer hell-type situation as not only meaningful, but sacred, on fire with the same force that lit the stars. Compassion, love, the subsurface unity of all things. Not that mystical stuff's necessarily true. The only thing that's capital T true is that you get to decide how you're going to try and see it. This, I submit, is the freedom of real education, of learning how to be well adjusted. You get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't. You get to decide what to worship, because here's something else that's true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type of thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, or the Wiccan Mother, Goddess, or the Four Noble Truths, or some infrangible set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's been codified as myths, proverbs, cliches, bromides, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The trick is keeping the truth up front in your daily consciousness. Worship power. You will feel weak and afraid, and you will need even more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart. You will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. Look, the insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful, it is that they are unconscious. They are default settings. They're the kind of worship you just gradually slip into, day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And the so-called real world will not discourage you from operating on your default settings, because the so-called real world of men and money and power hums along quite nicely on the fuel of fear and contempt and frustration and craving and the worship of the self. Our own present culture has harnessed these forces in ways that have yielded extraordinary wealth and comfort and personal freedom. The freedom all to be lords of our tiny skull-sized kingdom, alone at the center of all creation. This kind of freedom has much to recommend it. But of course, there are all different kinds of freedom, and the kind that is most precious you will not hear much talked about in the great outside world of winning and achieving and displaying. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline and effort and being able truly to care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad, petty, little, unsexy ways every day. That is real freedom. I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech's central stuff should sound. What it is, so far as I can see, is the truth, with a whole lot of rhetorical bullshit pared away. Obviously, you can think of it whatever you wish, but please don't dismiss it as some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. None of this is about morality or religion or dogma or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about making it to 30 or maybe even 50 without wanting to shoot yourself in the head. It is about the real value of real education, which has nothing to do with grades or degrees and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over. This is water. This is water. These Eskimos might be much more than they seem. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to live consciously, adultly, day in and day out, which means yet another cliche is true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck. Thank you. That's the end of my lecture.